It's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, and I'm going to do so in this manner. On April 27th, 1961, in an address before many of America's most influential newspaper executives, President Kennedy said this: "Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion." He continued, "And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help man will be what he was born to be, free and independent." The late Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Gary Webb begins his book Dark Alliance, The CIA, the Contras, and the Crack Cocaine Explosion with this quote from I.F. Stone: "Every government is run by liars, and nothing they say should be believed." The book concludes with the author's admission that what we can do once the facts are out there is very little, not much, not now, and certainly not until the American public and its congressional representatives regain control of the CIA and shred the curtain of secrecy. Our keynote speaker tonight is one of our nation's most intrepid investigators, an indefatigable litigator, see, I told you I could say that, and a brilliant writer whose discipline and persistence have brought measurable progress to the subject of the CIA and its curtain of secrecy. Along with the distinguished scholar from Mary Farrell, Rex Bradford, he is the co-host of JFKFacts.org. He is the author of 2008's Our Man in Mexico, Winston Scott and the Hidden History of the CIA, and most recently, Snowstorm in August, which focuses on an extraordinary and deeply fascinating episode involving President Andrew Jackson and a politically ambitious prosecutor about whom at least one thing is well known: Washington, D.C. District Attorney Francis Scott Key. And on that note, They didn't pick no dummy to do this, you know what I'm saying? It's my pleasure to introduce Jefferson Morley.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm very moved to be here. I'm going to speak extemporaneously for a moment and divert from my speech. I live in Washington, D.C., a place that is perhaps in the entire country the least hospitable to our common endeavor. Wherever I go outside of Washington, I run into people who thank me for my work spontaneously, give me words of encouragement. Inside the Beltway, it's not so easy, and sometimes I feel lonely. I'm very happy to be here tonight because I don't feel a bit lonely. Thank you. After the House Select Committee on Assassinations issued its final report in June 1979, late-night talk show host Johnny Carson announced its conclusion that President Kennedy had been, quote, killed by a conspiracy whose perpetrators could not be identified. Johnny paused with his impeccable timing and he said, next thing you know, they'll be telling us Hitler started World War II. In that spirit of common sense and good humor, I welcome you to the 19th and best JFK Lancer Conference. I'm very happy to be here with my son, Anthony. As an underpaid writer, I would be remiss if I did not exploit this opportunity with your undivided attention to urge you to buy a copy of my book, Our Man in Mexico. Anthony and I have a table outside. We will gladly separate you from your money. You will not be sorry. It's a great read. My special thanks to Carrie McCarthy for those very kind words. I'm truly humbled by what you said, and all I can say is I promise to you and your family that I will do my best to live up to them. My warmest thanks to Deb for giving me the honor and the privilege to talk to you on this momentous occasion. The first time Deb invited me to talk at a JFK Lancer conference, I'm afraid I turned her down. I said I didn't feel quite ready to talk about my JFK reporting. She said, "Oh, Jeff, that's okay. All you need is a little bit of courage." And she said it so nicely that I didn't notice the damage to my cowardly ego for about 2 days. Some people like Deb because she's so sweet and so nice. I like Deb because she's so sweet and she's so nice and she's so tough. Deb represents the best of our movement, and a movement is what we are, a citizens movement that speaks up for historical truth. It comes as a surprise to my friends in Washington, but it comes as no surprise to me to see so many police officers, firefighters, veterans, and teachers in this audience. You too are this citizens movement. Unlike our friends today who met in Dealey Plaza, we are not afraid or ashamed to talk about the causes of President Kennedy's wrongful death. Like other movements that challenge entrenched governmental power, we are frequently dismissed, demonized, our work distorted or ignored. And yet, as every opinion poll on the subject shows, we retain our influence and we have the allegiance of the majority of the American citizenry. But of course, our work is not done, and that is what I want to talk about tonight. Where do we go from here? Today, tens of millions of people around the world are remembering the death of President Kennedy in this city 50 years ago. The continuing challenge we face is to explain why President Kennedy was killed, and this, let's face it, we have not quite yet done. I have friends who tell me that they know the answer to the question of who killed JFK. I have tried to believe them. I would like to believe them, but I cannot. And so I have sought a more credible story. And everywhere I go, I meet people who thank me for my reporting and encourage me to continue. In my moments of discouragement, which I confess are frequent, these kind words from strangers from all walks of life sustain me. So thank you for coming to Dallas for this commemoration of a terrible national tragedy, and thank you for listening tonight. I want to reflect on how we got here, what I learned, and where we are headed. My goal is to bring us together in a worthy and ambitious endeavor to achieve a decisive clarification of President Kennedy's assassination before we meet again 1 year from now. Is it possible? I think it is. But before I tell you why, let me tell you where I was 50 years ago today. I was about this big. I was sitting in a kindergarten class in suburban St. Louis, Mrs. Whitman's kindergarten class, near the Washington University, where my mother was a graduate student. Another teacher burst into the room and said the president had been shot, and she started crying. It was the first time I'd seen a grown-up cry. I don't remember much else about that time, except I have a vague recollection of people gathered around our black and white Philco TV. I don't remember hearing the name John Kennedy or Lee Oswald or Jack Ruby, although I know I must have. I only remember knowing that something important had happened, and I didn't know what it was. And I think that insight was carved into my childish psyche where it remains to this day. Something very important happened, and I don't know what it was. I grew up in an era of assassinations, though, unlike some of you, I was too young to have my heart broken by them. I was 10 years old when Martin Luther King was killed, and I knew that was important because I had figured out that the church down the street, the Lutheran Church, was named after him. A man named James Earl Ray was arrested. Then Bobby Kennedy was killed, and I didn't know much about him except he was President Kennedy's brother, and he was cool, and he had long hair. A man named Sirhan was arrested. When I was in high school, Gerald Ford dodged a bullet from Squeaky Fromm, and then another from Sarah Jane Moore. I was getting interested in politics at the time, and I simply assumed that when people ran for president, some of them would get shot, usually by someone with 3 names. The names were weird, but assassination was normal. It was so normal that when I majored in American history in college and wrote a senior thesis about Arthur Schlesinger's role in JFK's White House, I don't recall devoting a single moment to thinking about the end of JFK's presidency. It just happened. It was normal. My deeper understanding of American assassination in American life was born at the movies, and I found myself gravitating to films with assassination themes. The first was Alan Pakula's The Parallax View, the original paranoid thriller in which the reporter who discovers the conspiracy is blamed for it. Pakula's next movie, All the President's Men, had a more optimistic picture of the newspaper reporter's destiny. And when I walked out of the theater in downtown Minneapolis at age 17, I knew what I wanted to do in life. I wanted to be an investigative reporter for the Washington Post. As a college student, I saw Taxi Driver, in which Robert De Niro plays a loner and a nut who takes a shot at a Kennedy-style candidate who mouths political banalities. And it seemed to me that both types of scenario, the conspiracy and the lone nut, were realistic and plausible. After all the President's Men, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein had pierced the surface of politics to find the conspiracy below. But Taxi Driver rang true to me also. Not long after Bobby Kennedy was killed, my family had moved to New York City, which was then a kind of feral place where irrational people and pointless violence were common, visible, and menacing. I didn't doubt the reality of lone nuts because I'd seen a few of them. As I came of age and pursued my journalistic ambitions, what interested me was not the details of JFK's assassination, but the way people made sense of it. The dichotomy of conspiracy and lone nut presented two very different ways of thinking about political reality. It was that dichotomy that fascinated me and brought me to JFK's assassination. The year was 1983. I was a 25-year-old junior editor at Harper's Magazine, and it was, believe it or not, just the 20th anniversary of JFK's death. I thought it would be interesting to get one of my favorite intellectuals, Christopher Lasch, to write about it. Lasch was a bracing social critic and historian, combining both liberal and conservative impulses, and I was curious what he would say, since I hadn't made up my mind myself. He agreed to write a piece, and it appeared 30 years ago this month. It was called The Life of Kennedy's Death. In it, Lasch argued that a lone gunman theory was implausible and that JFK had been killed by some kind of conspiracy. He didn't attempt to say who was responsible, but he did say that Americans had to own up to the fact. And I recall we got an indignant letter from New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis, to which Lasch responded acerbically, and I was intrigued that two intelligent writers who I admired could view reality so differently. What accounted for that? In the years that followed, I began delving into the vast literature of JFK's assassination, and several things impressed me. First of all, there weren't very many good books on the subject, and second of all, the best that I could find contradicted each other. William Manchester's Death of a President reported without a shadow of a doubt that Lee Oswald had killed President Kennedy. And then I read Tink Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas, which shredded Manchester's thesis and showed that there were many good reasons to doubt that Oswald had acted alone. Third, I saw no way to resolve the contradiction, save to read more books, and that just made my problem worse. David Lifton and Robert Groden, Mark Lane and Priscilla McMillan, Mort Saul and Arthur Schlesinger. I had the sensation that the lone nutters and the conspiracy theorists were like two kids on a teeter-totter, one up, one down, the other up, one down. And before long, I had motion sickness and no inclination to write about the JFK story. And so I went about my journalistic business. In the 1980s, I devoted my reporting to the hottest story in Washington, the civil wars in Central America, especially the role of the U.S. government in supporting the military government in El Salvador. Many in Congress and the press said the U.S. should not support a government engaged in what can only be described as state-sponsored terrorism. Others said the U.S. government should support that government and seek to curb its human rights abuses. In my reporting, I discovered the role of the CIA in organizing the system of military death squads in El Salvador that sought to liquidate the leftists and anybody else who opposed the government. Through interviews and declassified records, I came to see the doctrinal and logistical underpinnings of the state terror system. The role of the State Department was to convince the world that the U.S. government was seeking to reduce the use of the terror that it sponsored. I also learned of my naivete. I thought that reporting the facts of the matter would change people's minds. I learned, to the contrary, that reporting these facts often led people to deny that they were facts at all. I learned that people do not use facts to create their understanding of the way the world works, but that they use their understanding of the way the world works to create their facts. To the extent I retained an interest in JFK, it was on the dynamics of public opinion. I wrote about the popular culture of the Kennedy assassination. In a piece for the Los Angeles Times in 1991, I described JFK's assassination as a kind of Rorschach test of the American mind. How we make sense of November 22nd, 1963, I wrote, is shaped consciously and unconsciously by our premises about the US government and the way power is exercised in America. Those 6 seconds of gunfire in Dallas's Dealey Plaza serve as an enigmatic inkblot into which we read our political concerns. My premise was simple. Tell me what you think about the US government, and I'll tell you what you think about JFK's assassination. If you have a lot of confidence in the integrity and competence of the federal government and major media organizations, you would likely agree with the official theory of a lone gunman. If you suspect or fear the power of government or believe there are hidden centers of power in America, you will likely suspect conspiracy. This remains true today, and I think this is why JFK's assassination is still so relevant. The JFK story is the enduring indicator of our collective suspicions about the legitimacy of our government. I will return to this point in a minute. It wasn't until I joined the Washington Post in 1992, in the fall of 1992, that I began to think about actually reporting on the assassination itself. The Post had taken the lead in attacking Oliver Stone's movie even before it came out, and in the newsroom, hostility to the conspiratorial viewpoint ran high. Although in newsroom discussions, I could tell that there was no relation between vehemence and knowledge. Some of the loudest voices denouncing Stone came from people who I could tell knew less about the JFK story than I did, and I knew that I was no expert. In the debate over Stone's movie, I felt I had nothing to add. I could not possibly produce an interpretation of the crime as powerful as Stone's. My colleague George Lardner had already taken a hard look at Stone's facts. I had nothing to add there. But when Congress passed the JFK Records Act in October 1992, I realized I had my opening. The law was the direct result of Stone's provocative vision. And let me just take a moment to thank him. Even his harshest critics should have the decency to acknowledge that he is personally responsible for rescuing the government's records of the early 1960s from the custodians of secrecy and returning them to the American people. Thank you, Oliver. With the JFK Records Act, I finally had something that I could write about. New information, not old theories. I set my goals narrowly and modestly. I would stay away from theories and stick to the facts. I wasn't looking for the proverbial smoking gun, a fool's errand if there ever was one. I was looking for a good story. I was looking for a good story about the CIA. I knew I wasn't going to figure out who killed JFK. More likely, I was going to find someone who knew the answer to that question. I didn't have a theory that the CIA was responsible. I didn't assume it. I didn't rule it out. I knew from my reporting in Central America that I could not dismiss the possibility of CIA involvement. An institution that would orchestrate the murder of thousands of civilian non-combatants and hide its actions behind a veil of secrecy, obfuscation, and propaganda could be an institution capable of orchestrating or condoning the murder of a single man, even a president. My method was time-tested. I was going to ask a variation of the basic question Woodward and Bernstein asked in All the President's Men. They asked, what did the president know and when did he know it? I took as my question, what did the CIA know about Oswald and when did they know it? And that has been my subject ever since. One time at the Washington Post, as I began to pursue the JFK story, a senior editor, a friend, took me aside. I believe she was genuinely concerned. And she said, Jeff, you shouldn't do this. This is not good for your career. And I remember thinking that that was an astonishing statement, and it only steeled my resolve to pursue that. If what she was saying was true, I knew that this was a better story than I had even imagined. What did the CIA know about Oswald and when did they know it? Answering those two questions would lead me to an interesting group of people who barely figured in the vast literature of the JFK assassination before the 1990s. These questions led me to Jane Roman, an aide to CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton. She knew about Oswald in November 1959, when she opened the CIA's first file on the man. She thought Oswald had acted alone, but she revealed that certain CIA officers had taken a keen interest in him, just 7 weeks before the assassination. These questions led me to Win Scott, the Mexico City station chief. He knew about Oswald in October 1963. He knew that the CIA had deceived the Warren Commission, and he thought Oswald was the instrument of a foreign conspiracy. These questions led me here to Dallas, to the home of Ann Goodpaster, Scott's proverbial right-hand man in Mexico City. In 2005, she told me that she thought Oswald acted alone, but admitted that a tape of Oswald, or rather someone identifying himself as Oswald, had survived the assassination, something the CIA had denied for decades. These questions led me to John Whitten, the Mexico City desk chief, who sought to investigate Oswald's Cuban connections after JFK's death. He knew about Oswald in October 1963, too. He thought Oswald acted alone, but he revealed a proper investigation had been thwarted by none other than James Angleton himself. These questions led me to George Joannides, the covert operations chief in Miami, whose assets among the Cuban exiles publicized Oswald's pro-Castro politics in a way he never could have done himself, and who resurfaced in the 1970s to stonewall Congress. We still don't know what he knew about Oswald or when he knew it, because the CIA has fought me in court for 10 years to prevent me and you and everybody else from seeing his reporting from 1963. And my lawsuit seeking Joannides' files led to a sworn deposition from a senior agency official who disclosed for the first time that the agency retains 1,100 assassination-related records that it has no intention of making public in any form anytime soon. I reported as much in JFK Facts last May, and the revelation is finally beginning to pierce the consciousness of the dullards in the Washington press corps. I'm glad to say that this week, White House reporters asked the White House for comment on this trove of secrets. They didn't get an answer, but at least they are starting to ask the right questions. I say, it's about time. Collectively, these stories build on a foundation of fact, first established by Sylvia Marr and Mary Farrell, then reinforced by Gaten Fonzie, John Newman, Anthony Summers, and others. To Sylvia, Mary, and Gaten, who I never had the privilege of meeting, I can only say, I thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. We can now say without fear of contradiction that senior CIA officers knew much more about the accused assassin in the weeks before JFK's assassination than the American public ever knew or was ever told, and that there was no unanimity among them about Oswald's sole responsibility. We know that the CIA concealed this information, even from their colleagues. We know that the CIA lied about this knowledge to the Warren Commission and the public in 1964. We know that the CIA subverted the congressional investigation of 1978. And we know that the CIA retains tens of thousands of pages related to JFK's assassination that it has never made public. But what do these facts mean? When I recently shared these facts with a well-known journalistic acquaintance, he assured me that they were evidence the CIA had, quote, royally screwed up, but that such, quote, loose connections, unquote, did not prove a conspiracy. I agreed they did not prove a conspiracy. I suggested that they proved the CIA was still hiding something relevant to understanding the causes of President Kennedy's assassination. He pooh-poohed the idea. I asked him if I could quote him, and he said no. I confess I felt one of those moments of discouragement. I guess I had succumbed to my youthful hopes that facts might shape understanding. They don't. Why is this so important to you? An NPR talk show host asked me earlier this week. And I confess I felt another moment of discouragement and irritation. I said, Mister, listen, you live in this country. Somebody killed the president in broad daylight, and I don't really know who was responsible, and you don't really know who was responsible either. The government and the national security agencies have told a story that there are many good reasons to doubt, and that most of your fellow citizens don't believe. I know it happened a long time ago, but in case you hadn't noticed, that same government and those same national security agencies have the same credibility problem today. It's the same government that claimed, at least during the Bush years, the right to torture its perceived enemies. The same government that still claims the right to violate the 14th Amendment and assassinate U.S. citizens without U.S. due process. That claims the right to violate the Fourth Amendment by engaging in mass surveillance without a warrant. That lied about its mass violation of the Fourth Amendment and continues to persecute journalists and whistleblowers who revealed the lie. And that same government, let's face it, has royally screwed up the urgent plans for universal health insurance. So the problem of who killed JFK is important to you and me. It's a problem of constitutional and Republican government, and JFK's suspicions are the indicator that it remains in jeopardy. You just prefer not to think about it because the problem is so damn daunting. It's an impulse which I can well understand, but I do not share it. Actually, I didn't say that. I just wish I had. I didn't say it because I didn't want to sound self-righteous, and I wanted to say something constructive. I tried, and I wasn't so clear and concise, and afterwards I realized that the reason I was irritated, not just by the question, but my own lack of a quick, clear answer. I was, in short, hurting for a soundbite. The question, why does the JFK assassination still matter, is intimately connected with the question of what are we going to do about it? And in a world where public discourse is dominated by sound bites, we need some. So what I'm going to do in closing is to suggest some better sound bites, not for the sake of being clever or being right, but for the sake of getting the JFK problem out of my life before I return to Dallas next year. Is it possible? Like I said, I think it is. I see signs of progress, like Secretary of State John Kerry expressing serious doubts about the theory of a lone gunman, like a White House reporter asking Jay Carney about the CIA's 1,100 secret JFK records, like a primetime Fox News special casting doubt on the official theory of a lone gunman, like CNN picking up on Bill Kelly's very important work on the Air Force One tapes, like 10,000 people a day clicking on JFK facts this week. I know, I could cite a dozen counterexamples in the media this week too. But you know what? I'm not going to. The way I look at it, I'm going into a street fight to defend the life and legacy of President John F. Kennedy. I'm not going to beat myself up before it starts. I look out in this room and I see a lot of friends who got my back. I look at the polls, I see a lot of American people behind me. I look at my speed dial and I see I've got Oliver Stone and Deb Conway on my side. I kind of like my chances. The way I look at it, we've got another year of sustained attention to the JFK problem. From now until the 50th anniversary of the Warren Report, people are going to be talking about JFK's assassination, about the limited coverage of this year's anniversary, about the enduring questions, about the secret records, and about the popular disbelief. Of course, major news organizations invested in the political status quo and unsettled by the disturbing historical record of the assassination are not going to pursue the story. But if you haven't noticed, those news organizations are losing their dominance to the disruptive forces of a networked world in which anyone has the means to reach a mass audience. So let's not forget that we have the motive, the means, and the opportunity. I will continue to pursue the story. I know Bill Kelly will. I know Deb Conway will. I know Jim DiEugenio will. I know Russ Baker will. I know Joan Mellon will. I know Bill Simpich will. I know Stu Wexler will. I know Larry Hancock will. Let's be this disruptive force, and we can prevail. So what can we do? I think we first need to understand that we now live in the world of these young people, the students of Ed and Michael, okay? It's tempting to complain about the unfair coverage, the attempts to marginalize and demonize, the ridicule and the silence. I know that drill all too well. But we need to understand that such defensiveness and denial are the last gasp of the old order. We have seen the internet sweep away the power of entrenched interests in less than 2 decades. We can do the same. The internet has abolished the powers of the gatekeepers who controlled the history of JFK's assassination for too long. The record of the JFK story is now available to everyone who wants it, and we are in a much better position to influence the distribution of that real historical record than ever before. I checked my website an hour ago. 400 people a minute were visiting. That's more people than are in this room right now, every minute. If a young person wants to know the real history of JFK's assassination, where do they go? Not to the government. The National Archives website has a couple of hundred JFK records online. Where do they go? Not to the private sector. The major news organizations have collections of nice feature stories, but they don't have the records themselves. No, the students of the JFK assassination go to civil society. They come to us, to the Mary Farrell Foundation, created by my friend Rex Bradford. That's where people go to understand this story now. Second, we need a new mental paradigm, I think. The internet elevates our power and our mission. We are a research community, but we can become much more. We can, in the next year, become a civil society movement empowered by the internet. The internet has provided the means for ordinary people to attack and penetrate the overweening and illicit system of secrecy that controls the information that rightly belongs to the people. And not just the history of Kennedy's assassination, but many areas of our history. We need to study the origins and tactics of WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden to understand how we too can wield the disruptive power against the self-interested narratives of the national security agencies. We need a new entrepreneurial attitude to drive our status. We are Edward Snowden, the ordinary man who says enough is enough. And they are General Clapper. The people who criticize us, the partisans of the lone gunman, are General Clapper, the once powerful functionary, discredited and disgraced by the exposure of his lies. We are Netflix, streaming new information on demand into every household that wants it. They are Blockbuster, a legacy franchise waiting arrogantly for customers to come for them, destined for bankruptcy, though they don't know it yet. We need to direct our empowered and entrepreneurial movement in actions to move public opinion. It is the only way to transcend and defeat the attempts to marginalize us. To complain is to lose. Let me say that again. To complain is to lose. Did Martin Luther King spend his time saying the many racists who opposed him were cynical and immoral people imbued with unjustified superiority and indefensible arrogance? He could have, but he didn't waste his breath. And our opponents in the struggle for public opinion are nowhere near as heinous as King's foes. He recognized among his enemies a wide variety of people, some cynical, some fearful, some persuadable, and some hopeless. That's how I look at partisans of the official theory of JFK's death. Some cynical, some fearful, some persuadable, and some hopeless. But King sought to persuade his enemies regardless of their status by concrete actions that showed the world the indefensible and hypocritical nature of their position. He sought them to move them by appealing to the better angels of their character, even though some of them had no better angel. But others among his foes who did have better angels or who wanted to have a better angel could hear his message and not be threatened by it, could reconsider in the quiet of their conscience, and so eventually, slowly, gradually, but definitively change their minds. We can do the same. We need to channel our newly empowered and entrepreneurial message into concrete action that can persuade and force change. I want to propose 2 actions here for the next year. We need a sustained and focused attack on the secrecy system that denies the people their history. In my lawsuit, Morley versus CIA, my attorney, my counselor, my friend, Jim Lessar, has shown that one man, alone and unaided, can do and can defeat the CIA. We need more Jim Lessars. We need to conceive and execute an ambitious legal strategy that aims to liberate the remaining secret records of JFK's assassination in the next year. We need to come together with we need to come together with a single coherent alternative to the official theory that most people doubt for good reasons. We need, I think, a civil society response to the Warren Commission to be delivered on September 30th, 2014, the 50th anniversary of that document. We need another report on the assassination of the president, and not one compiled by a handful of lawyers working at the mercy of the FBI and the CIA and the White House, but by civil society, empowered by an aware citizenry and armed with the real records of the assassination. We need a crowdsourced, data-mined, fact-checked, downloadable account of how and why President Kennedy was killed, and we need to be able to publish it on multiple platforms free of charge on September 30th, 2014. That is a very tall order. We are by nature a disputatious bunch. If we didn't have the courage of our convictions, we wouldn't be here. If we didn't like to argue, we would have given up long ago. If we didn't defy consensus, we'd be home reading Vincent Bugliosi and mourning the death of Arlen Specter. And if we didn't think that we were right all the time, we wouldn't take verbal shots at our colleagues who mostly share our beliefs. I've done that. I want to apologize for that, and it's got to stop. We have to figure out a way to come together, to find common ground, and that may be our biggest challenge of all, to put aside our individual certainties in the service of a collective message that says to the American people, here is the story you've been waiting for. Here is the true story of why President Kennedy died in this city 50 years ago. September 30th, 2014 is 311 days from now. So tonight, let's do what today's ceremony in Dealey Plaza did not do. Celebrate the life and legacy of John F. Kennedy. And in the morning, let's get to work. Thank you.